The 23rd nanny quit at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, screaming that my silent, beautiful triplets were devils. I was starting to believe her. The 23rd nanny quit at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was on a video call with our Tokyo office, trying to close a deal worth more than my house, when the screaming started. It wasn't the children screaming. That I was used to. This was the high-pitched, ragged shriek of an adult who has seen something that has broken their perception of reality. I slammed my laptop shut, muttering apologies, and sprinted down the marble hallway towards the playroom. I found Maria, a sturdy woman with 20 years of childcare experience, cowering in the corner, her face sheet white. My 3 5-year-olds, Leo, Finn, and Chloe, stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, perfectly silent. They stood in a tight triangle, holding hands, their identical blue eyes fixed on her. The air in the room was cold, electric. "They're devils," Maria whispered, her voice trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She pointed a shaking finger at them. "Devils in the flesh." On the floor between her and the triplets lay the shattered remains of a heavy porcelain vase that had been on a high, sturdy mantelpiece. There was no conceivable way they could have reached it. I'd made sure of that. It flew, she stammered. It flew across the room and exploded. They just stared. I sighed, a deep, bone-weary sound that had become my native language. I paid Maria 3 months' severance in cash, right there on the spot, just to get her to stop looking at my children like they were monsters. As her car peeled out of my long, winding driveway, leaving a trail of gravel and fear in its wake, I was left alone once again with my silent, beautiful, terrifying children. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away during their birth, leaving me with 3 perfect copies of her face and a house that had become a gilded prison. We had money, yes, a sprawling estate, every toy a child could dream of. But we had no peace. We had no normalcy. The agencies had started calling them the silent storm. Leo, the oldest by 7 minutes, was the anchor. He was watchful, intense, and never ever smiled. Finn was the physical one. If something was going to be climbed, broken, or thrown, he was the catalyst. And Chloe, my sweet Chloe, was the quietest of all. She would hum, a low, continuous, and deeply unsettling tune that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house. They never spoke a single word. Not Dada, not Mama, nothing. They communicated with each other through a complex series of glances, subtle gestures, and a shared, unnerving stillness that could descend upon a room without warning. They were a single entity in 3 bodies, and they had driven 23 trained professionals from my home. The stories the nannies told were always dismissed as exaggeration, or outright lies, born of the stress of handling 3 difficult children. Nanny number 9, a sweet girl fresh out of college, swore she saw the old rocking horse in the nursery moving violently back and forth on its own while the children sat across the room, watching it. Nanny 17 called me at work, hysterical, claiming she had walked into the kitchen to find every single knife from the block arranged in a perfect gleaming circle on the floor, points facing inward, with the triplets sitting calmly in the middle of it. By the time I got home, the knives were back in the block, and the kids were finger painting. I put it down to a stress-induced hallucination. I had to. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. After Maria left, I knew I was done. The last agency I'd called had politely but firmly told me they had no one else to send. I was blacklisted. The whispers had grown too loud. I was a single father, trying to run a global corporation, and I was failing at the one job that truly mattered. I sat in my cavernous study that night, the silence of the mansion pressing in on me, and made a decision. No more nannies, no more childcare specialists or child psychologists. I would hire a live-in housekeeper, someone to manage the house, to handle the laundry and the meals, to simply be another adult presence in the oppressive quiet. I wouldn't even ask her to mind the children directly. I just needed help holding the chaos at bay. Her name was Elara. She was older than the nannies I usually hired, perhaps in her late 50s, with kind eyes etched with wrinkles and hands that looked strong and capable. Her references were impeccable, but she came from a small, local agency, not one of the elite national services I was used to. There was a calmness about her that was immediately disarming. During the interview, I laid it all out. "My children are challenging," I said, the understatement of the century. "They don't speak. They can be destructive. Your duties would be strictly domestic. I just need someone who won't be easily rattled." Elara simply nodded, her gaze drifting towards the doorway of the living room, where Leo, Finn, and Chloe had silently appeared. They stood in their usual triangle formation, their eyes fixed on her. Most people recoiled. They would offer a nervous smile or a wave, which the children would ignore, amplifying the awkwardness. Elara did neither. She just looked back, a flicker of something unreadable, not fear, not pity, but curiosity in her expression. "A quiet house is not always a peaceful one," she said, her voice soft but clear. She took the job. Her first week was unnervingly calm. The house was cleaner than it had been in years. The humming from Chloe seemed to lessen. The triplets still watched Elara, tracking her every move as she dusted and polished, but the destructive energy that usually vibrated around them seemed to have subsided. I allowed myself a sliver of hope. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe all they needed was a different kind of presence, a quiet anchor in their chaotic world. On her 8th day, I was working from my home office when I heard a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the rhythmic, frantic creaking of the old rocking horse in the nursery, the one from Nanny No. 9's terrified story. It was getting faster and faster, the wooden runners slamming against the floorboards with a violent intensity. I bolted from my chair and ran to the nursery, my heart pounding with a familiar dread. The scene that greeted me was worse than I could have imagined. The rocking horse was thrashing back and forth like a wild animal, its painted eyes seeming to bulge with a life of their own. My children were huddled together against the far wall, their small bodies rigid with tension, their identical eyes wide with what I could only describe as terror. And standing between them and the possessed toy was Elara. She wasn't screaming. She was just watching it. Her brow furrowed in concentration. She turned as I entered, her face pale but her expression steady. I opened my mouth to shout, to ask what was happening, but she spoke first, her voice low and urgent, cutting through the noise. "Sir," she said, her eyes never leaving the demonic rocking horse, "they are not the ones making it rock. They are trying to make it stop." My mind struggled to process her words over the violent crashing of the rocking horse. "Stop it?" I choked out, taking a step forward. "They're 5 years old. What do you mean they're trying to stop it?" The horse slammed forward with such force that one of its wooden runners cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The triplets flinched in unison, a tiny collective gasp of effort escaping their lips. Chloe's low hum had changed, rising in pitch and intensity, vibrating in my teeth. Leo, my little anchor, had his eyes squeezed shut, his face contorted in concentration. Finn had his small hands balled into fists, his knuckles white. They weren't making a mess. They weren't having a tantrum. They were fighting. "Don't get closer," Elara commanded, her voice sharp, never taking her eyes off the possessed toy. "You'll break their focus. They're connected. Just watch." I was frozen, torn between the paternal instinct to snatch my children away and the paralyzing awe of what I was witnessing. Elara began to speak, not to me, but to them. Her voice was a low, soothing murmur, like a chant. "It's all right, little ones. You are strong. Stronger than the echoes in these walls. Breathe. Push it back. You are the masters of this house, not the memories." As she spoke, the chaotic energy in the room seemed to shift. The rocking horse's frantic movements became jerky, stuttering. It bucked one last time, lifting clean off the floor for a heart-stopping second, before crashing down with a final, shuddering thud. Then, silence. A silence so profound it was louder than the noise that had preceded it. The horse was still. The air grew warmer, and my 3 children collapsed onto the floor in a heap, their bodies limp with exhaustion. Before I could even move, Elara was there, scooping them up. She didn't struggle with their weight. She gathered them like a hen gathering her chicks, and they went to her. their small heads resting on her shoulders and in the crook of her arm. They didn't look at me. They clung to her, the protector who understood. I had never felt so much a stranger in my own home, to my own flesh and blood. Later that evening, after she'd put the sleeping triplets to bed, Elara found me in my study. I was pouring a drink with a hand that still wasn't quite steady. "The Nannies weren't lying," I said, my voice hoarse. It wasn't a question. "No," she replied softly, standing by the door. "They were just telling a story they didn't understand." She told me she had grown up in a family where people were sensitive. She chose her words carefully, speaking of energy, of places holding on to strong emotions like a recording, and of children, especially multiples, being like tuning forks, resonating with things the rest of us can't perceive. "They aren't devils, sir. They are gifted. And they are terrified." She explained that their silence wasn't a disability. It was a shield. Speaking would require a different kind of focus, a focus they couldn't spare because all their energy was spent holding back the noise. The destructive outbursts? Those were the moments their shields failed, when the energy they were trying to suppress would lash out, using them as a conduit. The knives in the kitchen weren't a threat. They were a hastily constructed cage of iron to trap something only they could see. The broken vase wasn't thrown by them. It was thrown at them. My entire world tilted on its axis. Every memory, every panicked phone call, every terrified Nanny's face replayed in my mind, but now through this new, insane, impossible lens. The wild triplets weren't wild. They were soldiers in a war I hadn't even known was being waged, right under my own roof. For the next few days I watched them. I really watched them for the first time. I saw how Leo would subtly position himself between his siblings and a certain shadowy corner of the library. I noticed how Finn would sometimes press his hands flat against a wall, as if trying to push something back. And I heard the nuances in Chloe's hum, how it would become dissonant and agitated whenever I walked near the locked door to the master suite, the room I had shared with Eleanor, a room I hadn't entered since she died. Feeling a sliver of courage I hadn't possessed in 5 years, I unlocked that door. The room was just as we'd left it, covered in a thin film of dust. On her nightstand was her silver jewelry box, the one with the tiny ballerina that played a delicate, tinkling version of Clair de Lune, when opened. My heart ached as I lifted the lid. The sweet, sad melody filled the stale air. I closed it quickly, the grief too sharp, and retreated from the room, locking it behind me. That night I was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. It was music. It was Clair de Lune drifting up from downstairs. A cold dread, colder than anything I'd felt before, washed over me. I crept out of my room and down the grand staircase. The music was coming from the center of the dark living room. There on the mahogany coffee table sat Eleanor's silver jewelry box. It was open. The tiny ballerina was spinning, and standing around the table, in their familiar triangle, were my children. But this time their posture wasn't one of concentration. It was one of pure, abject fear. The air was glacial, raising goosebumps on my arms. This feeling was different. It wasn't just a chaotic memory. It felt personal. It felt angry. As I took a step into the room, Chloe, my silent, humming Chloe, turned her head. Her blue eyes, identical to her mother's, were wide and filled with a terror that ripped my soul in two. She looked directly at me, and for the first time in her 5 years of life she spoke. Her voice was a tiny, perfect, horrifying whisper. "She doesn't like us here." The 2 words hit me with the force of a physical blow. She doesn't like us here. It wasn't just that Chloe had spoken. It was the chilling simplicity of the statement, the tiny voice delivering a verdict from a world I couldn't see. The music from the jewelry box tinkled on, a grotesque counterpoint to the suffocating cold in the room. I looked from my daughter's terrified face to the spinning ballerina, and then to the empty space all 3 of my children were staring at. A space right behind me. A wave of ice cascaded down my spine. I didn't dare turn around. "Who, Chloe?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Who doesn't like you here?" Before she could answer, the lid of the jewelry box slammed shut with a crack that echoed in the cavernous room. The music died instantly. In the ensuing silence, the children broke. Leo let out a sob, a raw, wrenching sound I'd never heard from him, and buried his face in Finn's shoulder. Finn, ever the physical one, stood his ground, but his small body was trembling violently. They were still staring at that spot just behind me. Suddenly a light flicked on. Alara stood at the top of the staircase, her hand on the switch, her face a mask of grim resolve. "Get the children, sir," she said, her voice calm but steel-edged. "Now!" Her presence broke the spell. I rushed forward, scooping Chloe into my arms while grabbing Leo and Finn's hands. Their skin was ice cold. I practically dragged them towards the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I risked one glance back into the living room. It was empty. The jewelry box sat on the table, closed and silent. But the cold was still there, a malevolent presence that felt like it was watching us go. I got them to their room, and Alara followed with a glass of warm milk for each of them. They drank it greedily, huddled together on one bed, their eyes still wide and haunted. Alara didn't press them. She simply sat on the edge of the bed and began to hum, a low melodic tune that was the complete opposite of Chloe's agitated vibrations. It was warm, grounding. Slowly the trembling subsided, and their breathing evened out. They fell asleep in a tangled pile, their small faces finally looking peaceful. I followed Alara out into the hallway. "It's Eleanor, isn't it?" The name felt like a betrayal on my lips. Their mother. Alara leaned against the wall, her calm demeanor finally cracking to reveal a deep weariness. "Grief is a powerful energy, Mr. Croft. So is love. But sometimes when a soul is torn away too suddenly, too tragically, that energy sours. It becomes possessive, jealous." My mind reeled. Eleanor had been the love of my life. She was gentle, kind, full of light. The idea of her spirit being a source of terror for her own children was blasphemy. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not her. She loved them. She wanted them more than anything." "She wanted you," Alara corrected gently. "And she lost you. She never got to hold them, to know them. From her perspective, they are the reason she is gone, the reason you are here, and she is not." Her words painted a picture of a love so fierce it had curdled into a bitter, lonely rage. Eleanor trapped in the house she had so lovingly decorated, watching me raise the children she had died to give me. Had her lingering presence been the noise the triplets were fighting all along? Was her grief the echo in the walls? The rocking horse, it had been a gift from her parents for the nursery. The knives, they were part of a set I'd given her for our first anniversary. Her jewelry box, her most treasured possession. It wasn't random objects. It was her objects. "Why is it getting worse?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why now?" "Because of me," Alara said, her gaze steady. "Before I came, they were alone in their fight. Their shields were strong, but their focus was inward, a constant defense. My presence gave them a focal point, an ally. It allowed them to relax just enough to start pushing back, to try and cleanse the house. Tonight, when you opened her room, when you opened that box, you invited her to the forefront, and their attempt to push back provoked a direct response. She sees them as a threat to her memory, to her space. A chilling thought occurred to me. The 23 nannies, had they all been driven out by a jealous spirit, using her children's abilities as a weapon? Was she trying to isolate them, to keep me all to herself, even in death? The next day the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken tension. The children were clingy, refusing to leave Alara's side. They wouldn't go near the living room or the master bedroom. I found myself watching the shadows, flinching at every creak of the old house. I felt like a trespasser, hunted in my own home. That afternoon, I was in my office trying to work, but the words on the screen were just a blur. I kept hearing Chloe's tiny, whispered voice in my head. A flicker of movement in the polished surface of my mahogany desk caught my eye. It was a reflection. A faint, distorted reflection of the doorway behind me. In the reflection, a woman was standing there. She was tall and slender, with long, dark hair, wearing a flowing white dress. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew that dress. It was the one Eleanor had worn on our last anniversary dinner. My blood ran cold. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my grief-stricken, sleep-deprived imagination. I counted to 5, took a deep breath, and slowly opened them again. The reflection was gone. I let out a shaky sigh of relief. It was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. I swiveled my chair around just to be sure, to prove to myself that the doorway was empty. But it wasn't. Standing in the hall, not as a reflection, but as a solid, shimmering form, was my wife. And she was smiling. It wasn't the warm, loving smile I remembered. This was a thin, tight, possessive smile. Her eyes, the same blue as our children's, were fixed on me, and they were filled with a cold, terrifying rage. She lifted a hand, her form flickering like a faulty projection, and pointed a single accusatory finger. Not at me, but at the framed photograph on my desk, the only one I had. It was a picture of me, smiling, holding Leo, Finn, and Chloe in my arms. The sight of her, so real and yet so horrifyingly wrong, shattered the last of my denial. This wasn't just energy or an echo. This was Eleanor, or at least the ghost of her, twisted by grief and anger. The air crackled, and the framed photo on my desk began to vibrate, its silver edges humming against the wood. Her smile widened as she saw the terror in my eyes. This was what she wanted, to reclaim me, to erase the children she blamed for her absence. A child's whimper from the hallway broke the terrifying tableau. Leo, Finn, and Chloe stood there, hand in hand, with Alara just behind them, her face pale but resolute. They had seen her too. Eleanor's form flickered violently, her rage now directed at them. "Mine!" The word slithered through the air, not as a sound, but as a thought, a feeling of cold, venomous possession that invaded my mind. The photograph on my desk flew upwards, hovering for a moment before hurtling towards the children, but it never reached them. Before I could even react, Alara stepped forward, placing herself directly in the photo's path. "No," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. The photo stopped dead in mid-air, a foot from her face, and dropped to the carpet with a harmless thud. Eleanor's apparition shrieked, a silent psychic scream of pure fury that made the lights flicker and the windows rattle in their frames. She lunged, not at Alara, but through her, aiming for the children. At that moment, something inside me broke. The fear, the grief, the 5 years of confusion and helplessness coalesced into a single, roaring wave of protective instinct. "Eleanor, stop!" I roared, my voice raw with anguish. I ran and stood between her and our children, my arms spread wide. "They are not the enemy. They are our children. They are a part of you." Her shimmering form halted, her face contorting. The cold rage in her eyes was now mixed with a profound, soul-deep confusion. The triplets, sensing the shift, did something I had never seen before. They let go of each other's hands. They took a hesitant step forward, no longer a defensive triangle, but 3 small, separate individuals. And Leo, my stoic, silent Leo, reached out a tentative hand. He didn't try to touch her. He just held it out, an offering. Finn then pointed a small finger, not at the ghost of his mother, but at me, and then at himself and his siblings. Chloe, my sweet Chloe, looked up at the ghostly image of the woman whose face she shared, and her humming started again. But this time, it wasn't the agitated, defensive vibration. It was a soft, pure, melodic sound. It was the tune of Claire de Lune from the jewelry box. It was her mother's favorite song. It was a language beyond words. With their simple gestures, they were telling her their story. "He is our father. We are his children. You are our mother. We are a family." The rage in Eleanor's eyes began to recede, replaced by a wave of sorrow so immense it was a physical force, washing over the room. Her form began to lose its sharp, angry edges, softening into the woman I remembered. The white dress seemed less like a shroud, and more like the gown she had loved. Her gaze shifted from the children to me, and for the first time I saw not a monster, but my wife, lost and in pain. Tears I didn't know I had streamed down my face. "I miss you," I whispered, the words I had kept locked away for 5 long years. "I love you, but they need me, and they are all I have left of you." The ghost of her smile, the real one this time, touched her lips. It was faint, sad, and beautiful. The oppressive cold in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a gentle warmth, like the first rays of sun after a long storm. She looked at our children, one by one, her spectral eyes filled with a dawning recognition, a flicker of maternal love finally breaking through the possessive grief. She raised a translucent hand and almost touched Chloe's cheek. Then she began to fade, not violently, but gently, like smoke caught in a sunbeam, until she was gone. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or oppressive. It was peaceful. The house felt quiet for the first time. Truly quiet. I knelt, and for the first time, my children came to me, not out of fear, but for comfort. They wrapped their small arms around my neck, and I held them, my 3 impossible, incredible children, and wept. From that day on, everything changed. The destructive outbursts stopped. The humming became singing. And one evening, a few weeks later, as I was tucking Finn into bed, he looked up at me and said, clear as a bell, "Good night, Dada." Soon, Leo and Chloe followed. The words came in a torrent, as if a dam had finally broken. They had been there all along, just waiting for the storm to pass. Ilara stayed with us, not as a housekeeper, but as a part of our strange new family. She taught them and me about their gift, how to shield themselves, how to ground the energies around them, how to understand the world they perceived so differently. They weren't cursed, they were protectors. Their silence had been their armor and their bond, their strength. The house on the hill was no longer a prison. It was a home filled with laughter and chatter, and the occasional hum of a happy little girl singing her mother's favorite song. Eleanor never appeared again, but her presence remained, not as a cold specter in the halls, but in the brilliant blue of her children's eyes, and the fierce protective love that had finally set her, and all of us, free.